Ya ayyatuhan nafsun mutmain. Arabic terms, there is another terminology. It's called nafs. Why is it important?
The word psyche from the Greek, that means soul. Pathos from the Greek is suffering, is the protest of the psyche when it's being ignored or violated, to keep the appointment with your own soul. And if you don't, then it begins to pathologize. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. Wherever the parent has been stuck in their shadow, the child inherits that. Begins to take on a different flavor when you realize that psychotherapy is about listening or attending to the voice of the soul.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Khan Klinics, powered by American Muslim Today. Today, we're very excited to introduce our esteemed guest in our studios, Dr. James Hollis, a distinguished Jungian psychoanalyst and author. Dr. Hollis earned his degree from Manchester University and Rooh University and spent 26 years teaching humanities before training as a Jungian analyst at the Jung Institute in Zurich. Dr. Hollis currently lives in Washington, D.C. and teaches psychoanalyst. He has numerous leadership roles, including executive director of the Jung Educational Center and the Jung Society of Washington. He has also many publications and presented at many national and international seminars. Dr. Hollis is a professor of Jungian Studies at Saybrook University and has authored over 20 books, which have been translated into many languages, reflecting his profound impact on depth psychology. Dr. Hollis' work delves into key Jungian concepts such as persona, ego, which is in an Islamic context can be understood as the self or the soul that represents an outward individual identity present to the world. The shadow, as we call it, Kareen in Arabic, is a Jungian psychology akin to the Islamic notion of inner self hidden aspects, reflects the unconscious side of our personality, including repressed weaknesses and desires. His exploration of the psyche, the Rooh, aligns with the Islamic understanding of the soul, which encompasses our spiritual essence and inner reality. Dr. Hollis also emphasizes the significance of dreams, which, both from Jungian and Islamic perspective, are seen as a window into the conscious mind and a source of divine guidance and introspection. The introspection so as to be the Maraqaba or the self-inspection of one's. Jungian psychology developed by Dr. Carl Jung focused deeply on the psyche and the introspections. Dr. Hollis continues his exploration with great depth and clarity, bridging these profound psychological concepts with spiritual insight. So let's get to Dr. Hollis and dive into the discussion we had with him today on these numerous topics. So we're going to get right to Dr. Hollis. Dr. Hollis, welcome to our studios and to our podcast today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, Dr. Hollis, we're going to get right into the questions, and please do explain to us first a little bit about the self S, the S with the self, and the sense of self.
Well, first of all, when we talk about the nomenclature of analytic psychology, we need to think of those terms as verbs, not nouns. And I make that distinction because they're labels we put on energy processes. The psyche is fluid, it's flow, it's energy, and it's constantly moving. And what Jung and other depth psychologists have tried to do to sort of map that flow, just as physicians try to map the circulation of the body. So if we think of the self, when we use that term, the first thing that comes to our mind in our culture is, well, that's who I am, that's myself. That's really the ego speaking to itself. And the ego is an old Latin term that means I, who I think I am at the moment. The I is a cluster of energy that we're not born with it. We begin to accrete it by the experience of being split off. Before birth, presumably, we're walking through the sleep state of the universe. All our needs met, we're violently expelled into this world, and slowly begin to realize the me and the not me, and the I and the thou, and that sort of thing. And that's how the ego begins to form. So the ego at any given moment has a sense of itself. When Jungian psychologists talk about the self with a capital S, to try to distinguish it from the ego's sense of self, they're really talking about the whole person. Descartes famously said, trying to solve the question, do I really even exist? Is this some sort of dream? He said, I think, therefore I am. Well, that was the ego splitting itself off from the organism of nature that's continuing to be nature. But at any given moment, the ego can be occupied by some other kind of psychological energy, split off. So, for example, when you're a child, you're told not to touch the oven, it's too hot. Well, sooner or later, the child's going to do that, and it now has an experience that it incorporates within itself, and it can begin to recognize certain shiny objects that may be attractive, could also be threatening in some way too. So that becomes what is called a complex. Now, a complex is a neutral word, like apartment complex, airport complex. It's a cluster of energy, but it has a value to it. Is it positive? Is it negative? All right. Is it helpful to you? Is it harmful to you? So even when I speak as myself, well, which part of me is speaking? Is it the frightened child who's speaking? Is it the compliant personality that is speaking? And as we all know, we early on start reading the world around us. Is it safe? Is it unsafe? Can I approach you, the parent? Or do I need to keep my distance? What happens when I express my needs? Do you run to support and help me? Or are you absent, or you get angry or punitive or whatever? We all develop operative, reflexive, protective systems to help us adjust to life, stay out of harm's way, and get our needs met as best we can. And we take that, though, and put it in different life situations. And then you begin to realize from time to time, maybe the choice I made or the pattern that I'm unfolding in my adult life is really driven by some of those earliest experiences or sort of perspectives that the child had. And so if we are creatures of adaptation, as you know, and because we can adapt, we can fit into the circumstances around us sooner or later with varying degrees of effectiveness. But the more we adapt to what is outside of us, the more we begin to separate from the natural organism that each of us is as a creature of nature, right? As a functioning animal. So we can say the conscious part of me, the ego, only has a small insight into the magnitude of the operations that are going on constantly in our brains and our emotions and physiology and so forth. And at the same time, it's a self-governing system. And so what are the operative systems within it? And that depends to some degree on what our nature is seeking to express in the world, and to some degree, we formulated a sense of self. Am I to keep my mouth shut? Am I to comply with what people ask of me? What is it that I need to do to fit in, get my needs met, and so forth? And so that's where I come in, is trying to sort through all of that traffic to discern what is the natural self seeking in this person's life.
A self that is unconscious, and that's not governed as per your definitions, and that there is a sense of self. It's called ego.
Yes.
A lot of it is ego, and in Arabic terms, there is another terminology. It's called nafs. Then on your self part, your S capital self, which is unconscious, there is a concept again of, like you just mentioned, of psyche, just alluded to it. And then there's a lot of mention of Rooh being in the Arabic version or the Islamic version, the mention of Rooh descriptively coming in repeatedly parallels with the psychoanalysis. Now, yes, we're talking now two different parallels, something 1400 years ago given, and the modern psychoanalogy talking about Rooh. Could you explain a little bit about that part to us in psychoanalysis terms? How does that come about? And then we'll look at the definition of it, because you've mentioned in your books a number of times how it's an organic being, it has feelings, and it's autonomous, it's independent, and for some reason it does not go parallel with your, it's an organic being, but not a worldly sort of organic. It's not fulfilled.
Nature wishing to express itself and then being put into an artificial situation such as our cultures are. Our commercial operations, our religious institutions, our educational institutions, our governmental institutions, and so forth. And if those systems are supportive of what the psyche wants or the soul wants, then you'll feel a sense of belonging, support, and sense of wholeness. But to the degree they're not, then there will be an internal conflict. And that's where we experience our symptomatology or psychopathology. Psychotherapy is about listening or attending to the voice of the soul.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
What you might call the divine part of every person, that is to say, the transpersonal part of every human being. What we become is a series of reflexive responses to the challenges of life, and patterns of compliance with the pressures of the external world, for example, or patterns of avoidance or power complexes that are compensatory and so forth. So what you become, necessarily so, this is not to be judged, it's to recognize those adaptations were probably necessary to protect oneself, because our adaptations are in service to getting our needs met as best we can as relatively powerless children, and staying out of harm's way. So we learn patterns of avoidance or patterns of compliance to circumstances that are not conducive to our own emotional well-being. It's sort of like if you were forced to eat a certain food and it was not healthy for the body's going to register its dismay, and it'll increase its protest till it finally gets our attention. And that's often what brings people into psychotherapy.
I want to just quickly quote you an ayah. It's from Asad 32:9. The body was fashioned, and Rooh was sort of like breathed into it. This is exactly the same word. The Rooh, وَنَفَخَ فِيهِ مِنْ Rooh. Rooh was actually put into the body, and then the human was Sama'u al-Basaru al-Afida, meaning he was given sense of hearing, a sense of eyesight, and the fahm, to think as well, and a heart. Surprisingly, goes in parallel to what you were just explaining right now about the Rooh, and you have mentioned in your other areas of the book how it sort of flows through the body. And it's got, like you just mentioned, it has its feeling, and it can transform where you, meaning from an initial bit to a butterfly, you quoted that in your book. So I'm coming to my question now. The question is how you think the Rooh is in the beginning, the psyche, we're saying Rooh. You've mentioned that there is a first half of life, and how in the second half of the life, if you do not nourish it, it starts to protest even more. So much so that it can lead to we'll talk about what it can do, but can you explain a little bit? Do you think that the Rooh, when you're young, is naive a little? It's a little abstract, but matures over a period of time, and then it starts asking the question more. When you hear, when you can think more, it demands more.
Certainly, and after all the traditions, great religious traditions, have been looking at the same phenomenon, which is the phenomenon of humanity. So they bring their understanding of what happens to the human being and what it means to be human. So there are bound to be these important overlaps, because there are going to be insights from all the great traditions about the same thing. They may use different language, different metaphors, but they're headed in the same direction. So just to back up a little bit, we are matter, we are animals, and yet the word animal, anima, is Latin for soul. It's like an ensouled animal. That is to say, there's an autonomy to this. And that one of the characteristics, most of the animal kingdom, to the best of our understanding, is driven by instinct, the instinct to eat, to procreate, to protect itself from predators, etc. But as far as we know, it doesn't create religions, it doesn't create social economic systems. It doesn't suffer neuroses. It can be frightened by predators and act instinctually to protect itself, as we do. But it doesn't anticipate, let's say, its mortality in a way that humans do. As children, we have one message and that life gives us, and it's accurate, actually, and that is the world is big and you're not. The world's powerful and you're not. So how are you going to fit in? And so we either give the world what it's asking of us, or we spend our life trying to find ways to get away from that. Either way, we're responding to that rather than something that's coming out of us, which is our natural, instinctual, and spiritual expression. So in the first half of life, we have, as children and young people, the same kinds of frustrations, but generally speaking, the continuing demand of the world is to fit in, to get an education, leave your parents, get a job, be self-supporting, form commitments in life, perhaps become a parent, all useful and social functions that are necessary to maintain a family and a society. On the other hand, at some point in one's life, and this often happens to people, as you know, they will have done all the right things as they were instructed to do so, or as they believed they were needing to do to fit in. What is the soul asking me? Which is, what is the self asking me, rather than what my ego or my complexes are asking of me? And that's a humbling experience. It doesn't make you feel great and on top of the world. It says, I have to go back to the drawing board. That's what took me into 6 years of analysis in Switzerland. It wasn't that I was planning to change my life. I wasn't planning to change my careers. I moved from academia to psychoanalysis as a therapist. It was simply to try to say, how do I get this depression to go away? It was, as a child, I felt them so strongly. I needed to defend myself against their strength. And of course, things don't go away, they go underground and come up somewhere else. And so I began to realize that in this humbling experience, I thought I'd done the right things, but my own psyche is protesting. We have to question why we rush too quickly to medication, to say, well, let's have this problem go away, rather than say, why has it come to me? Is it possible that my own soul is trying to connect to me? Energy system is another, that if I'm doing what's right for me, the energy is there. Now, in real life, we have to mobilize energy to get up at 3 a.m. and change the baby's diaper, whatever is needed to go to work on time. But if you keep, we all know this, if you keep diverting your energy to places that are hostile to the well-being of your own soul, it's going to show up as boredom, enervation, ultimately self-medication, depression, whatever. And thirdly, dream or autonomous reactions. Something in the psyche knows us better than we know ourselves. And I was interested to find from sleep research that we average about 6 dreams per night. And everybody's going to say, well, I don't dream that much. I don't remember my dreams. So it's serving some role in nature. Nature doesn't waste energy. And secondly, to really pay attention over time, you begin to realize there's an other inside of each of us that is seeking to communicate with us.
You talk in your books about you've got to shut up, suit up, and show up, which means that mentally stop talking about other stuff, but address this issue about the call
Yes.
with your soul. If you don't do it now, it's going to eat you up from inside, or it's going to have a bearing. And then, Dr. Hollis, you also mentioned about how often you've got to meditate. This appointment or addressing the issue has been a form of meditation. We call it Salah, which is like going into a little prayer domain. You mentioned that it's probably twice, at least a day, morning, evening. You can break that out. Could you explain a little bit when you are doing that, and if you are doing that, what are the things you've got to try to address?
Well, I had a colleague in Ontario, now deceased, Mary Woodman, who said she always told her clients, if you're going to work with me, you need to dedicate a minimum of 1 hour a day to spend time with yourself, to meditate, to work with your dreams, to do something that responds to your interior. And she said, most people say, oh, I don't have time for that. I don't have that time. You should. Right. And then she said, then you're not ready to really work with your own soul here. In those moments, we have two summonses. One is to address what needs to be addressed in our world. First of all, you've always said, most of the clients who came to me, and I would find this true, at some level understood what their real task was. They've been trying to figure out all kinds of ways to avoid that, to keep the appointment with your own soul, in other words. And the purpose of the therapy then was to call us back, and you used a very important word, vocation. That's different than job. Job's how you pay your bills. Vocation is what you're called to be as a human being. That's a different matter. And sometimes they can come together, but they don't have to necessarily. But the point is, we all have appointments with our own souls. Do you keep the appointment? If you don't, then it begins to pathologize. One winds up in self-medication. One winds up dealing with depression. One loads up in medications. Or one lives a life of frenetic investment in the outer world, a world of distraction. There are people who have life far worse. So don't whine. Just shut up about that. Recognize there are people who are having their children killed. There are people who don't have enough food tonight. There are people who have no shelter. Your problems are minimal compared to that. So shut up. Now, shut up means do your homework. Don't expect things to happen just magically. Do what you need to do to facilitate change and growth, and pay your dues. And thirdly, step into life. Show up, not show off. Show up. Just do the best you can. Stop beating up on yourself. Just do the best you can. You have to pull out of the noise, pull out of the traffic to recover a sense of self. So I try to, before I work with clients every day, I spend time with myself and see what my dreams were saying the night before, or what's coming up, saying, all right, but what is that really about? But what is really seeking its expression in the world through us? That is not self-absorption, it's not narcissism. It's, in fact, humbling. It means, oh, well, here's another thing I didn't know about myself. I have to pay attention to that. Oh, here's something I'm called to face. He don't put it this way. He said, there are three pieces to this work of self-healing. He said, first is insight. That's where psychology can help. But he said, from that point on, it really depends on the moral character of that individual. Second, he said, is courage to face whatever tasks life brings us. And thirdly, he said, is endurance, sticking it out over time. Insight, courage, persistence, endurance. And when we bring that to the table, we regain a sense of purpose and dignity in our lives, even if it's conflictual and difficult.
I want to quote quickly a ayah from Hud 11:14. Just very quickly. وَقِيمَ الصَّلَاةَ طَرَفَ النَّهَارِ وَذُلْفًا مِنَ اللَّيْلِ. Basically meaning that establishes your salah. Salah meaning that same connection, disconnecting from the world and connecting to something else. Do it at the both extremes of the day, the mornings and the evenings. So it's giving a specific time, just like how you've mentioned, in your 24 hours, try to dissociate, break it up into two, and then contemplate the day and the night. Because the next bit is very interesting as well, because it also talks about yudhibana sayya, which essentially means the negative, the negativity, the thoughts that are there. You got to try to wipe them out. In this specific case, it talks about your negative sins, negative things that you accumulated, because when you are doing that, you're establishing a little connection. Which brings us to our next bit, is about talking about the shadow, or addressing what we call the Kareen. Kareen is like your, I want to phrase it a little cautiously, devilish part. The part that we have to be mindful about. وَمَنْ يَعْشُ, there's another quote, ayah 43:36, which talks about and whoever turns a blind eye to the reminders, he will be at the disposal then of the Kareen, the disposal of the devilish one, close to him. And then it specifically says, Shaitanun fahuwa lahu Kareen. You'll become more near to that part of the shadow of the Kareen. You, Dr. Hollis, also talk about that a lot in your therapy analysis. Would you explain what's connection here with the shadow, and how do we have to dispel that off with constant reminder, with the meditation, that this exists and needs to be addressed, just like the Rooh wants something?
What we don't address inside of ourselves gets spilled onto our children, to our partners, to our society. So there's a deep moral function in looking at one's own shadow. Because if I don't address it in some way, it keeps spilling into the world onto others. And that's a harmful thing to do to others. That's why Jung said once, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. Wherever the parent has been stuck in their shadow, the child inherits that, and often has to either repeat it, which is common, or spend their life trying to get away from them. If we're not conscious of them, they just keep spilling into the world. If we are forced to become conscious of them, or we invite that dialogue, then we realize that many of the things we do are in service to, say, motives or agendas that are not comfortable to us or may be inconsistent with our values. But you don't want your life governed by your fear responses, right? That's a shadow issue. So if I'm going to unhook my decisions in the outer world, I'm going to have to face my fears. And you can see why that's a reason to keep all of that underground, because I don't want to do that. And that's why it has that autonomy. Or maybe some of my motives are really selfish and manipulative, and I don't want to look at myself in that light. But then again, those behaviors continue to bring harm to those around us. Or maybe it's coming out of my insecurity that I'm seeking to demonstrate something with someone else, or control or manipulate them or something. One of the wisest things said about this was from the Roman playwright Terence, who many millennia ago, or 2.5 millennia ago, nothing human is alien to me. So it's easy for me to say, well, I could see all your flaws, but I'm not capable of seeing mine. I know who the enemy is. It's you, right? That's why this work is not narcissism and not self-absorption. It's about being accountable. That's the central thing. That's one of the most important words I could use here, is accountability. In the second half of life, as we begin to look at our history and to see some of those patterns. I mean, none of us wake up and says, well, today I'm going to do the same harmful or stupid things I've done for a long time, but we will if we stay on automatic pilot here. But to begin to say, all right, but where is that coming from in you? I often ask clients to examine, a certain impulse or behavior or pattern. What is that in service to inside of you? That's the key. Because one of the characteristics of shadow is we usually have, we have to start dealing with it in some way, a ready or rationalization. Well, I did this because you did that, or because you didn't do that. So you see, in other words, I'm disowning any responsibility for this. Freud talked about a young man who tried to disown his own dreams. He said, but, there were things in my dreams I would, they're not me. And Freud said, well, whose dream do you think you were just talking about? It was your dream. Your psyche embodied it. So the greatest task you can do for others is to work on our own shadow. Because one thing is clear to me, and I wrote about this in the book on relationship, is that no relationship with another person can be more evolved than our relationship to ourselves. Because where I'm stuck, where I'm blind, where I'm refusing to be accountable, it's going to play out with the other person sooner or later. And that's why I keep looking to the other person to fix this or something like that, when in fact the work that I have to do is my own work. That's the best thing I can do for you.
Address the Kareen, come at peace with it, and constantly remind yourself about its existence. The modern science differs with that. They're always mentioning about that dreams being abstract, probably, like you mentioned, like they're describing as it being it's just a thought process. What's your thoughts on the dreams? Because reading Religion and Follower, I believe that dreams have a meaning, and especially in all of the religions, other than Islam, prophets were able to see dreams. They had true meanings. They had to follow, which is a higher level of state, obviously. But every dream had a meaning. I want you to know, Dr. Hollis, where do you stand on the dream part, and how do humans have to address the dreams when they see something?
Sure, and first of all, we have to recognize it's a natural function of the human organism. And again, nature doesn't waste energy, so it has a purpose. We have to ask that purpose. Sleep researchers also tells us if you reach 80 years old, and I'm 84, if you reach 80 years old, you'll have spent 6 years of your life dreaming. That's not sleeping. You'll be spending up to a third of your time sleeping, but 6 years. That's extraordinary. And I think there are two basic reasons here. First of all, is the raw experience of stimuli that come to us every day that has to be processed. Whether we pay attention or not, it's serving a natural function. The material in there has to be processed in some way. If it isn't, it will show up in some pathogenic way. Secondly, if you pay attention to it over time, you begin to realize, again, there's something in the psyche that's responding to our lives, what's happening to us, what our choices are. Who would ever make this up consciously? The autonomy of those images and the wisdom of those images that pull somebody out say from childhood, you haven't seen for years. It's unlikely you're still processing the relationship with that child, but the psyche has reached in. It's like a movie director who goes to central casting and saying, I need to have somebody to embody this issue for this person, for this interior movie that we're having here. And what's so hard about dream interpretation is we tend to look at it strictly from the standpoint of the ego. And therefore we can be frightened by our dream. We can even try to manipulate our interpretation. So perhaps we can help avoid our shadow, or we're threatened by what it might ask of us. So the ego is not that trustworthy when it comes to dream interpretation. That's why the therapist has to work with the person to help them bring out their associations with these images. Well, your psyche's not going to pay attention. It has its own autonomy, and it's going to be responding whether you like it or not. But when a dream image comes up, we have to start saying, when I experience that image, what are the associations I have? And if you dream of your grandmother, and I dream of my grandmother, well, we had different grandmothers. What aspect of our experience is the psyche pulling on? I mean, it's really detective work. You can work for hours on a single dream. Jung used to say at the beginning, he said, I have no idea what this dream is. It's a product of your psyche, but together we'll sort of process it together until such time as it begins to open the layers to us. Dreams often have various layers. And so over time, you begin to realize that there are certain motifs that follow, there are dream threads that follow. And to give you a quick example, I've had several people who had very negative or traumatic experiences with a father or mother, and their dreams initially bring up the traumatic aspect of it. And over time, as you work on that, the image of that parent begins to evolve, and so many have begun to see their parents as someone else's wounded child, or someone else who was caught in a dilemma. And what happened to the dreamer was less personal than it seemed at the time, and more coming out of the hurt of that person's experience. And you begin to see the intrapsychic image of that parent figure evolve and be more integrated. And often there's a sense of understanding, even forgiveness, that can come from that. I mean, think of all the daily repetitions that we went through as children, absorbing what we think are the messages of our family and our culture to us. And that doesn't just disappear overnight. It has to be assimilated. It has to be worked through. It has to be understood. And asking questions like, well, what does that experience make me do, or what does it keep me from doing? And that's a very pragmatic question. If you can address that question, all right, let's just say there's a certain fearfulness. We have a certain area of life we're called to, but we're afraid of doing it. It's coming out of our sense of having, experienced trauma around that in our life, or lack of confidence in ourselves, or whatever. I mean, everybody has self-esteem issues. Even the narcissists, they're the ones with the greatest problem with self-esteem. That, just say, all right, now, what is this really asking of me? And, what does this make me do? What does it keep me from doing? And the moment you make that conscious, guess what? Now ego consciousness has a new agenda. Are you going to bring to that insight the courage and the persistence necessary to actually evolve and integrate that part of your psychological history? Or is it going to be off over here and operating autonomously in your life, perhaps sabotaging your life and continuing to keep it as a prisoner of history?
There is a word mentioned in Arabic. It's called Sakeena, peace, tranquility, to the extreme that comes to it, because now the body and the Rooh are both energies that are working in the same direction. And the nafs itself, there is another ayah 89:20 says Ya ayyatuhan nafsul mutmain. And then the nafs itself, the ego also becomes mutmain, meaning satisfied, meaning that it's also at peace. So the aim is try to align all of these things together. Would that be when you think that a human being as be able to face now the death ultimate as well with ease?
Well, certainly. In the Western world, as you know, we have this word neurosis. It became a term that was invented in the 1790s by a Scottish physician, and they thought it was because your neurology was disturbed in some way, that you have emotional symptoms. Well, to get around the notion of neurology, we have to say what we've called neurosis is really the split between my adaptations and acculturation and the natural desire of the self to express itself in the world through me. Now, the more I can bring those two together, the greater I'm going to have a sense of purposefulness, sense of harmony, and so forth. And this is an ongoing work because whatever we might achieve momentarily can get out of balance as we have to deal with the challenges of life very, very quickly. So this is, a daily vigilance, a daily paying attention. And of course, part of this work slowly begins to reposition that ego because the fear of death is all the ego's fear. It's not nature's issue. I've had the experience and the sorrow of being with people who died and animals who were pets that died. And generally speaking, pets had no fear. It was a natural process for them. Or in the midst of life, we are death, as the old saying has it. Well, it's all around me. I can't say that I want to die. In fact, one of my chief reasons for staying alive is I happen to love my wife. I want to be there for her. She needs my help. Secondly, I'm still curious about the world. I'm still enjoying learning so much about the world. It breaks your heart at times, but you're still learning about the world. But there's a part of me, too, that is perfectly accepting. I do understand. As Jung put it, we're a short pause between two great mysteries. So it's not about what the mystery is. That's the mystery. It's what we come from and what we enter into as mystery. The question is, have you lived your life as honestly as you could while you were here? Did you step into it? Jung said we all walk in shoes too small for us. What he meant was we become our protective adaptations. And that's understandable. But the more we live that, the more we're playing out of our powerless past. The less we're identified with the ego and more with the soul, the more we're likely to realize. And in doing so, I think it helps us get away from the urgencies of the ego that says, but I'm the boss and I must be in control and so forth. And so autonomy of the body, aging, mortality are the ultimate, confrontations with that ego fantasy of being the boss. It's a tiny cluster of energy and a large ocean. And rather than be threatened by that, I realize that's the life force that's been carrying me through this. And it's not death that I fear. And what I fear is not living my life with meaning and purpose is what I fear. And that's where I'm accountable to myself and my own soul on a daily basis.
Being honest and being humble. I think that's a beautiful message for all of our viewers and to myself as well. Dr. Hollis, I just want to thank you very much for being so generous with your time today.
It's all of the personal. To have this conversation. I thank you in turn.
And we all really enjoyed it. We thank you very much for your time. And we also wish you good health. And
thank you.
Hopefully we can have you back in our studio some other times because there's so many other concepts and brilliant animals and other parts that we have not touched on, but we are mindful about the time and we really, really appreciate you being with us. Thank you very, very much.
You're quite welcome. I wish you well.
We wish you well too. Have a blessed day, sir. Thank you.
Salah.